The silence in Elliot Hayes's cabin wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence. A living thing that had grown thick and heavy over 14 years, filling every corner of the single room like smoke from the wood stove in winter. It was the sound of a man who had stopped speaking because there was no one left to hear him. The cabin sat at 9,000 feet in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico, perched on a granite shelf where the air was thin and the wind never stopped. From the single window above the dry sink, Elliot could see 60 miles of high desert stretching toward the horizon, all sage and stone and emptiness. He had chosen this place precisely because of what it lacked: people, questions, memory. It was September 14th, 2024, a Saturday, the fourth day of the year that Elliot Hayes would drive down from his mountain. He stood by the window in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the first pale edge of light touch the jagged peaks to the east. He was 54 years old, but he looked older, weathered. His face was carved from the same hard granite as the mountains, all sharp angles and deep lines. His hair, still thick, fell past his collar in waves of brown, heavily streaked with gray. A dense beard covered the lower half of his face, untrimmed and going white at the edges. His eyes, when they bothered to focus on anything, were the color of winter sky: pale, remote, empty. He moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of a man who had performed these same actions 1,500 times. Boots cracked, leather worn soft as cloth, jeans faded to almost white at the knees. A heavy flannel shirt, red and black plaid, the cuffs frayed. Over it, a brown leather jacket, the kind that had seen decades of use and would see decades more. He didn't check a list. The list had been burned into his memory so deeply it was no longer thought, just reflex. Flour, salt, coffee, kerosene, diesel for the truck. Anything else was a luxury. Luxury was a complication. Complications were how the world got back in. He walked outside into air so cold it hurt to breathe. The truck sat where it always sat, a 1993 Dodge Ram 2500, forest green paint, faded to the color of old moss. It was a massive, ugly thing, all hard angles and rust spots, but the engine was sound. Elliot maintained it himself with the same grim attention he gave to everything else that kept him alive. The engine turned over on the second try, coughing blue smoke into the crystalline air. He let it warm while he stood in the yard looking at nothing. The sun was clearing the peaks, now spilling gold across the valley floor 8,000 feet below. It was beautiful. Elliot didn't see it. He saw only the road, the descent, the errand, the return. The drive down took 90 minutes. The narrow Forest Service road switched back and forth through stands of aspen and ponderosa pine, following a route that was barely maintained and completely impassable from November to April. Elliot drove it without thought, his hands light on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. The truck knew the way as well as he did. As the elevation dropped, the forest opened up into high desert scrubland. Pinyon and juniper replaced the pine. The air warmed. By the time he reached the outskirts of Taos, the sun was fully up and the temperature had climbed into the low 60s. Taos was a town that survived on art tourism and a kind of calculated bohemian charm that Elliot found incomprehensible. He had no use for it. He had no use for any of it. He timed his trips for Tuesday mornings in the off-season when the galleries were closed and the streets were mostly empty. Today was Saturday, the mistake in scheduling he'd made because he'd lost track of the days. It happens sometimes. His destination was Anderson Feed and Supply, a low cinder block building on the south end of town that smelled like dust and fertilizer and didn't ask questions. To get there, he had to drive past the Taos County Animal Shelter. He hated that building. It was a squat concrete structure set back from the road, surrounded by a chain-link fence and a parking lot of cracked asphalt. It was a place of endings, a facility designed to process the overflow of human carelessness. Abandoned dogs, feral cats, the injured, the old, the unwanted. Elliot never looked at it directly. He kept his gaze fixed on the opposite side of the highway, on the sagebrush in the empty horizon, and he pressed down slightly on the accelerator. Today he couldn't. The sound hit him first, cutting through the closed windows of the truck like a physical force. It wasn't the usual chorus of barking, that sad, desperate noise that leaked from every animal shelter in America. This was different. This was percussion. The heavy, rhythmic slam of a large body throwing itself against metal again and again with the kind of frantic energy that spoke of pure panic. Then a man's voice, sharp and rising, a shout of pain. Against every instinct he had built over 14 years, Elliot slowed the truck. He pulled onto the gravel shoulder 50 yards from the shelter's entrance. He told himself he was just stopping to let traffic pass. He told himself he would pull back out in 30 seconds and continue on to Anderson's and never think about this again. He killed the engine. The silence of the cab pressed in on him. Through the windshield, he could see two men in the shelter's parking lot. One was wearing a tan county uniform, stumbling backward from a large metal transport kennel mounted on a flatbed trailer. This was Officer Clayton Pierce, Animal Control, and he was clutching his right forearm. Blood was seeping through the heavy canvas of his sleeve, dark and wet. His face was sheet white with shock and anger. The other man was older, mid-50s, with the wary posture of someone who'd spent a career managing impossible situations. This was Captain Robert Kane, shelter director. He was reaching toward Pierce, trying to assess the injury. But Elliot wasn't looking at the men. He was looking at the transport kennel. Inside was a blur of gray and white fur, a large German shepherd thrashing with a violence that made the entire trailer rock on its suspension. The dog would lunge forward, hit the kennel door with a sickening metallic thud, spin, and lunge again. It was not attacking the door. It was trying to escape through it, to break reality itself, if that's what it took to get out. Elliot's hand, which had been resting on the gear shift, tightened until his knuckles went white. "Turn around," the voice in his head said, the voice that had kept him safe for 14 years. "Not your problem. Not your world. Drive away." He put the truck in gear. His foot moved to the accelerator. He physically turned his head, ready to merge back onto the highway. He would go to Anderson's, buy his supplies, and be back on his mountain before noon. This moment would dissolve into the background noise of the world he no longer inhabited. He glanced at his side mirror. He froze. Something was wrong with the dog's posture. Elliot had been a handler. He had lived, breathed, and slept with working dogs for 2 decades of his life. He knew their language the way other men knew their native tongue. This wasn't just panic. This wasn't even rage. He killed the engine again. The sudden silence in the cab rang in his ears like tinnitus. He got out. The September sun was warm on his face. The air smelled like sage and diesel and something else, something metallic and sharp. Fear. The dog was radiating it like heat. He stood by his truck, ignoring the shouts from Pierce. He watched the animal, and his blood turned to ice water. The dog's eyes were wrong. They weren't narrowed in aggression, the calculating focus of an animal preparing to fight. They were wide, blown open, showing white all around the dark iris. Prey eyes, panic eyes. The ears were wrong. They weren't forward challenging. They were pinned flat against the skull, so flat they almost disappeared into the thick ruff of fur at the neck. But it was the head that stopped Elliot's heart. The dog wasn't focused on Pierce. It wasn't focused on the kennel door. It was hitting. Between lunges, its head would snap upward, muzzle pointing to the sky, eyes scanning the roofline of the shelter building, scanning the empty blue horizon above them, as if searching for something coming from above. "He's scanning," Elliot whispered. The words were lost in the wind. "He's looking for the high ground." The world dissolved. The smell of diesel and sage became the smell of diesel and hot dust. The bright New Mexico morning became the crushing white heat of midday in Helmand Province. The sound of the barn hitting metal became the sound of boots on hardpan and the low hum of radio chatter in his earpiece. He was walking 20 feet behind Axel. Axel was a black and tan German shepherd, 90 pounds of muscle and intelligence and absolute loyalty. He had been working the scent line for half a mile, nose down focused. They were approaching a cluster of mud brick compounds, the kind that dotted the desert like scabs. Suddenly, Axel stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. His eyes went wide, his ears pinned back, and his head snapped up, scanning the rooftops of the compound, scanning the high ground. Elliot had grabbed his radio. Axel's alerting. "High threat. He's scanning the rooftops." 3 seconds later, the sharp crack of an incoming mortar round split the air. The world exploded. Elliot stood by his truck in the Taos County Animal Shelter parking lot, shaking. He couldn't breathe. He was not seeing a transport kennel. He was seeing a mud wall. He was not seeing a gray and white shepherd. He was seeing Axel, frozen in that last moment of terrible certainty. The dog in the kennel lunged again. Its high-pitched cry of terror cut through the air, and it was not a bark. It was the sound of profound trauma. It was the exact specialized PTSD response of a dog trained for combat, a dog who had learned that death came from above. "It's not your problem," Elliot told himself. His voice was shaking. But it was a lie. The memory had him now. The ghost of Axel in that kennel wouldn't let him leave. Pierce was still yelling, "Get the catch pole. We're putting it down right here. I'm not taking it inside. I'm not risking anyone else." Elliot's legs felt like they were made of lead, but he moved. He took one heavy step forward, not back toward his truck, not back toward the mountain, toward the shelter, toward the men, toward the ghost in the kennel. Wait, Elliot said. It was the first word he had spoken to a stranger in over a year. The sound of his own voice was shocking, rough, and unused, like a machine that had been left to rust. The word hung in the air, thin and strange. Wait, he said again, louder this time. Pierce froze his hand halfway to the long aluminum catchpole leaning against the shelter wall. Captain Kane turned, giving the stranger his full attention. Kane knew this man, or knew of him. Everyone in Taos did. Elliot Hayes, the mountain man, the hermit who came down 4 times a year and spoke to no one. In 5 years as shelter director, Kane had never heard him say a word. Elliot took a slow step forward. He wore his usual uniform, faded jeans, the red and black flannel, the brown leather jacket hanging open. He looked lean, healthy, and profoundly tired. He stopped about 15 feet from the 2 men. Can I help you, Kane asked. His voice was calm, professional, the tone of a man who'd spent 20 years as an LAPD captain before retiring to New Mexico. Elliot's gaze was not on Kane. It was fixed on the transport kennel. The shepherd inside had paused, its assault flanks, heaving chest, slick with foam and drool. It was panting in short, rapid bursts, its tongue lolling. The dog, Elliot said. His voice was a low rasp, barely louder than the wind. Where did it come from? Kane stepped between Elliot and the agitated Pierce, a subtle move to de-escalate. Owner surrendered this morning. Said the dog was vicious, uncontrollable. Said if we didn't take him, he'd shoot him. We didn't have a choice. He's not vicious, Elliot said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an opinion. It was a diagnosis delivered with the flat certainty of a doctor reading an x-ray. Pierce let out a short, bitter laugh. His injured arm was still pressed against his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. Vicious. That thing just took a chunk out of my arm. It needs to be put down before it kills someone. Elliot ignored him completely. He kept his eyes on the kennel. He saw the terror in the dog's posture. He saw the way its paws were torn and bleeding from clawing at the metal. He saw the ghost of Axel. He's terrified, Elliot said. Kane let out a long breath. He'd heard this before from well-meaning volunteers who saw potential in every lost cause. Son terrified and vicious often looked the same from this side of the bars. I've been doing this for 20 years. First with LAPD, now here. I know what I'm looking at. He motioned toward the kennel. That dog is beyond saving. He's too far gone. He's a liability we can't afford, and he's a danger to my staff. A heavy silence settled over the parking lot. Elliot looked from the barn to Kane, then back to the dog. He felt the old familiar weight pressing down on him, the weight of failure that had crushed him in 2010. He had failed Axel. He had run from the world. And now, the first time he'd stopped running in 14 years, he was being told to walk away. Let me try, Elliot said. The words came out before he could stop them. Pierce let out another incredulous sound, half laugh, half groan. Try what? Get yourself killed. That shepherd will rip your throat out, old man. Kane just looked confused. Mr. Hayes, isn't it? Try what exactly? What do you do? Elliot's jaw tightened. He had not said these words aloud to another person since he'd buried his uniform in a cardboard box in the back of his closet in August of 2010. The admission felt like tearing open an old wound. I was a handler, he said, his voice dropping even lower. K9, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. The 2 letters changed the air. Pierce's scoffing died. Kane, the ex-cop, suddenly saw the stranger in a new light. He saw the way Elliot stood, not aggressively, but with perfect balance. He saw the quiet authority that had been there all along, hidden under the beard and the isolation. K9, Kane repeated, tasting the word. He made a decision. Pierce, he said, not taking his eyes off Elliot. Go to urgent care. Get that arm looked at. That's an order. But Captain, the dog, I will handle the dog. Go. Kane's voice carried the unmistakable steel of a man who was used to being obeyed. Pierce glared at Elliot, his face pale with pain and anger. Finally, he turned and stalked toward his county truck, cradling his injured arm. Kane turned back to Elliot. He's right about one thing. It's a risk I can't take legally. I can't let you in that kennel. My insurance, the county board, they'd shut me down. Elliot nodded slowly. I don't need to go in. He's still in the transport unit. Just leave him. Just give me space. He paused. And do you have a stool? A simple wooden stool. Inside the shelter's small front office, Dr. Lydia Warren had been watching the entire scene unfold through the window blinds. She was 29 years old, slender with strawberry blonde hair, pulled back in a ponytail, and pale green eyes that were currently wide with shock. She'd had her hand pressed over her mouth, horrified by Pierce's injury and the sheer violence radiating from the dog in the kennel. Now she watched completely baffled as Captain Kane walked to the equipment shed and retrieved an old three-legged milking stool, the kind used for barn work. She watched as Elliot Hayes, the ghost of the mountains, took the stool and walked calmly to a spot on the gravel about 10 feet from the transport kennel. He did not face the dog directly. He positioned himself at an angle, offering his side, not a confrontational forward stance. The dog, who had been quiet during the exchange watching, suddenly renewed its panic. Seeing this new human settle in so close, it began to bark. The sound was deep, explosive, a noise of pure terror that seemed to shake the metal kennel. It lunged at the door, hitting it with a heavy, solid thud. Elliot did not flinch. He did not look at the dog. From the deep inner pocket of his leather jacket, he pulled out a very old dog-eared paperback. The cover was missing. The pages were yellowed with age and stained with what might have been coffee or smoke or both. He opened it to a page marked with a folded piece of receipt paper. He began to read, or at least he appeared to read. His eyes were on the page, tracking the lines of text, but his entire being, every nerve, every sense was tuned to the animal 10 feet away. He was not ignoring the dog. He was creating a space around himself, an island of absolute calm in the center of the storm. Inside the office, Lydia turned to Kane, who had come to stand beside her at the window. "What is he doing?" she whispered. "That dog is going to have a heart attack." "He's not ignoring it," Kane said quietly. His eyes narrowed in intense observation. "He's outlasting it. Watch." The shepherd's frantic rhythm began to break. It would lunge, bark, slam against the door, and be met with nothing. No yelling, no rattling pole, no threat. Just the faint scent of a calm man, the whisper of wind through the pinyon trees, and the soft sound of a page turning. The dog lunged again, barked, stopped. It stared at the man. The man turned a page. The dog let out a noise that was half bark, half whine, a sound of pure confusion. It was being met with a language it did not understand. Absolute neutrality. The furious barking subsided into a low rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated in the dog's chest like an engine idling. It was still coiled tight, a spring of compressed terror, but the blind panic was fading. Elliot, without looking up, slowly turned another page of his book. The growling stopped. The shepherd was panting now, its sides slick with exertion, its tongue hanging long and pink. It was exhausted. Slowly, as if the strings holding it upright had been cut, it slid down onto its belly. But its head stayed up, ears swiveling forward and back, eyes locked on the strange, quiet man who refused to behave like a threat. Confusion was replacing terror. This human was breaking all the rules. He was not aggressive. He was not offering comfort. He was just there, as solid and unchanging as a stone. The dog's rapid, shallow breathing began to deepen, shifting from the hyperventilation of panic to the heavy, exhausted rhythm of an animal coming down from an adrenaline spike. Elliot sat on that stool for an hour. The sun climbed higher in the clear September sky, warming the gravel parking lot. He turned 3 more pages of his book, reading the same stanzas of Whitman's Leaves of Grass that he had read 1,000 times before. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic on the highway and the occasional soft jingle of a dog tag from the main kennel building where the adoptable animals waited. Finally, Elliot slowly closed his book. He placed it carefully back in his pocket. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. The dog instantly tensed, scrambling to its feet, a low growl starting deep in its chest. Elliot did not look at it. He picked up the stool, his back still mostly turned to the animal, and walked toward the office. He stopped in front of Kane, who had come outside to meet him. "That was something," Kane said quietly. He didn't know what else to say. "What now?" Elliot looked past him, up toward the mountains that were his refuge, his prison, his home. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. He walked to his truck, climbed in, and started the engine. He pulled out of the parking lot, leaving Kane and Lydia staring after him in silence. Inside the transport kennel, the gray and white shepherd, the dog, whose shelter intake form listed him only as Phantom, lay down for the first time in days. The frantic energy that had driven him for 72 hours was finally spent. He stretched out on the cold metal floor, his flanks still heaving, and rested his chin on his paws. But his eyes never left the spot where the silent man had been. Elliot drove past Anderson Feed and Supply without stopping. He drove through Taos, past the plaza, past the art galleries and tourist shops, and turned onto the Forest Service road that led back up into the mountains. But he didn't go all the way home. 10 miles up, where the road widened into a small clearing used by hunters in the fall, he pulled over. He killed the engine and sat in the cab, staring through the windshield at nothing. His hands were shaking. He gripped the steering wheel until the shaking stopped, but the tightness in his chest remained. He had just broken 14 years of carefully constructed isolation. He had spoken to strangers. He had involved himself in the world. He had seen Axel's ghost in a living animal and had been unable to walk away. "You're a fool," he told himself, but he knew he would go back. He sat in the truck until the sun began to dip toward the western peaks. Then he reclined the bench seat as far as it would go, pulled an old wool blanket from behind the seat, and closed his eyes. He did not sleep well. His dreams were full of the sound of mortars and the sight of Axel's wide, terrified eyes scanning the rooftops. He woke before dawn, stiff and cold. He drove back down the mountain as the first light touched the sky, and he was waiting in the shelter parking lot when Lydia Warren arrived at 7:15 to open the clinic. She saw him sitting in his truck and stopped, one hand on her car door, staring. Then she smiled just a little and walked over. Elliot rolled down his window. "You came back," she said. "I said I would." She studied him for a moment, this strange, silent man who had appeared out of nowhere and sat with a traumatized dog for an hour without saying a word. "I have coffee inside," she said. "It's terrible, but it's hot." "You want some?" Elliot hesitated. Accepting coffee meant conversation. Conversation meant connection. Connection was dangerous. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She nodded and walked toward the building. Elliot got out of his truck, grabbed the three-legged stool that Kane had left by the door, and followed her inside. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and dog food and sadness. It was a smell Elliot remembered from a dozen different facilities in a dozen different places. It was the smell of limbo, the space between what was and what might be. Lydia poured 2 mugs of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting since yesterday. She handed one to Elliot. He wrapped his cold hands around it and felt the heat seep into his palms. "He's been moved," Lydia said. "Captain Kane had him transferred to a quarantine kennel last night. It's more secure. Gives him space." Elliot nodded. "I watched you yesterday," Lydia continued. She leaned against the counter, holding her own mug. "I've worked with animals my whole life. I've never seen anything like that." "You didn't do anything. You just sat there." "That's the point," Elliot said. His voice was still rough, unused to this much talking. "He needed to learn that I wasn't a threat. Doing nothing is doing something." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" Elliot didn't answer. He took a sip of the coffee. It was, as promised, terrible. "The dog," he said, changing the subject. "What's his story?" Lydia set down her mug and pulled a clear plastic sleeve from a drawer. Inside were several pieces of paper, some official-looking forms, others just scraps. "Owner surrender," she said. "Guy brought him in 3 days ago. 50-something, angry, mean. Dragged him in on a choke chain, said he was broken, uncontrollable. Said if we didn't take him, he'd put a bullet in him." Elliot's jaw tightened. "We scanned the microchip," Lydia continued. "It came back registered to a private military contractor, but the contact info was dead." No response. "Then the guy threw this at me." She pulled out a folded set of papers, said it was useless garbage. She handed the papers to Elliot. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he unfolded them. It was a DD Form 2209, a military working dog medical record. Across the top was the seal of the Department of Defense. Below that, a discharge certificate, K9ID, P447, name Phantom, status military working dog, multi-purpose canine. Service dates January 2016 to October 2023. Unit Marine Corps Special Operations Command, discharge behavioral PTSD noise sensitivity. Elliot stared at the paper, the words blurred. He blinked, forcing them back into focus. "He was a soldier," Lydia whispered. Her eyes were bright with tears. "He served, and then he was adopted out to that man who did this to him." Officer Pierce ran the guy's plates. "He has a history, animal neglect charges in 2 counties. She wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand. "He beat that dog, Elliot. He beat a hero." Elliot stared at the discharge papers. A cold, slow-burning anger began to replace the grief in his chest. He had seen this before. Military working dogs were heroes in the field, but if they came back damaged, if they developed PTSD, if they couldn't be rehomed to their handlers, they were sometimes passed along, falling through the cracks until they ended up in places like this. He looked at the dog's ID photo, a small square image clipped to the form. Phantom, younger, healthier, staring directly at the camera with clear, intelligent eyes. He wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a reflection of Axel. He was one of Elliot's own. He handed the papers back to Lydia. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me, for the coffee." He turned and walked toward the quarantine wing, carrying his stool. Lydia watched him go, her coffee growing cold in her hands. The quarantine wing was a separate section of the shelter reserved for animals that were sick, injured, or dangerous. It was a concrete corridor lined with heavy chain-link kennels, each one isolated, each one a small cell of waiting. Phantom was in the last kennel on the left. The moment Elliot stepped into the corridor, the dog exploded. The sound was immediate and overwhelming, deep percussive barking that echoed off the concrete walls like gunfire. Phantom launched himself at the chain-link gate, teeth bared, the sound of rattling metal filling the air. Elliot did exactly what he had done the day before. He placed the stool 10 feet from the gate. He sat down, angling his body away. He pulled out his book and opened it to the marked page. He read, Usain, or he appeared to read. The barking continued for 18 minutes, this time shorter than yesterday. The rhythm was the same. Lunge bark slam, lunge bark slam. But the intensity was slightly less. The dog was learning that this particular human did not respond to threat displays. The barking faltered. It broke into that same confused whine. Phantom backed away from the gate, his paws leaving faint smears of blood on the concrete where his claws had torn. He retreated to the far corner of the run and lay down, but his head stayed up, his eyes locked on the man. Elliot turned a page. They stayed that way for 2 hours. When Elliot finally stood to leave, Phantom's head lifted immediately, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Easy, Elliot murmured. The word was barely a breath. I'll be back. He walked out, placing the stool by the wall where he could find it tomorrow. Outside, the morning sun was bright and warm. Kane was standing by the office, sipping coffee from a chipped mug that said, World's okayest boss. You're establishing routine, Kane said. It wasn't a question. Yes. How long do you think it'll take? Elliot looked back toward the quarantine wing. He could still hear the faint echo of Phantom's growl. I don't know, he said. As long as it takes, Kane nodded slowly. He looked at Elliot, really looked at him, seeing past the beard in the silence to the man underneath. I was LAPD for 23 years, Kane said. Robbery, homicide. I've seen a lot of broken things. People, animals, systems. Most of them stay broken. He took a sip of his coffee. But every once in a while, someone comes along who knows how to sit in the wreckage without making it worse. That's rare. Elliot didn't respond. He didn't know how. You need anything? Kane asked. Food, a place to sleep, that isn't your truck. I'm fine, Elliot said. Kane nodded. The offer stands. Elliot walked back to his truck. He sat in the cab for a moment, his hands on the wheel, staring at the mountains. He should go home. He should go back to his cabin, to his silence, to his 14 years of careful isolation. He started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove 10 miles up the mountain to the same clearing. He would sleep in the truck again tonight. He would come back tomorrow. The ghost in that kennel would not let him leave. The pattern held for 3 days. Elliot would arrive at the shelter before dawn, the sky still deep purple over the mountains, and he would find his stool waiting by the quarantine wing door where he'd left it. He would carry it to Phantom's kennels, place it exactly 10 feet from the gate, and sit. On the second day, September 15th, Phantom's initial explosion lasted 12 minutes. The dog still launched himself at the chain link, still filled the concrete corridor with that deep rattling bark that sounded like it was being torn from his chest. But there was a change, a subtle one. Between the lunges, Phantom would pause just for a heartbeat and stare at Elliot with an expression that was no longer pure panic. It was confusion tinged with something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the first faint stirrings of recognition that this human followed different rules. Elliot sat motionless, his book open on his lap, and waited. On the third day, September 16th, the explosion lasted only 7 minutes. Phantom retreated to his corner, faster, the exhaustion of sustained terror finally catching up with him. He lay down with his head on his paws, but every muscle in his body remained coiled ready. His eyes tracked Elliot's every micro-movement, the turn of a page, the shift of weight on the stool, the slow breath in and out. That afternoon, Elliot did something new. He slowly closed his book and placed it on the gravel beside the stool. He looked at Phantom, not directly in the eyes, that was still a challenge, but at his ears. Those radar dish ears that swiveled and rotated, trying to decode this strange human. Elliot had spent the last 3 days reliving Helmand Province, reliving Axel. He remembered the language they had shared, a private world built on German commands and subtle shifts in body weight, a language of trust he hadn't spoken in 14 years. His throat felt thick. Rusty. Sit, he said. The word was low, rough, barely louder than the wind that whispered through the ventilation grates. Phantom's head snapped up. His ears, which had been relaxed, lying flat in uncertainty, suddenly shot forward. They swiveled like satellite dishes, triangulating the source of that sound. He didn't sit. He scrambled to his feet, confused his body a question mark. He knew that word. It was buried deep beneath layers of trauma and abuse, but the muscle memory was there encoded in his brain during hundreds of hours of training. Elliot kept his voice low, rhythmic, almost like a prayer. He wasn't commanding. He was communing. Sitz, he murmured again. Guter Junge, sit. Good boy. Phantom's entire body trembled. He took a step forward, then a step back. He hit the rear wall of the kennel and let out a single sharp bark of pure confusion. Platz, Elliot whispered. Down. He remembered saying it to Axel in the belly of a C-130, the vibration of the engines humming through the metal floor, Axel's warm body pressed against his leg in the darkness. Bleeb, Elliot said, his voice barely audible. Stay. He wasn't commanding this dog. He was speaking to the ghost. He was speaking to the soldier he knew was trapped inside that terrified animal. Phantom paced the length of the kennel, whining. The sounds of his trauma were fighting with the sounds of his training. His body knew these words. His mind was still locked in a war zone. From the office window, Lydia had been watching the ritual every morning. She'd seen Elliot's strange routine, the sitting, the reading, the profound patience. But today she heard the words. She saw Phantom's electric reaction, the way his entire posture changed when Elliot spoke German. She made a decision. She grabbed a second mug, filled it with fresh coffee, and walked outside. The sound of gravel crunching under her boots made Elliot's entire body tense. He was in a delicate space, a fragile moment, and this was an interruption he didn't need. Mr. Hayes, Lydia said softly, stopping a few feet away. Elliot didn't turn. Ma'am, I brought you coffee. She held out the mug. It's cold out here this morning. You haven't moved in 2 hours. He slowly turned his head. He saw determination in her eyes, not pity, the concern of someone who understood what was at stake. He hesitated. Then he reached out and took the mug. Thank you, I heard you, Lydia said, nodding toward the kennel. The German? I think you're right about him. She paused. I think I know why you're right. Elliot looked at her, his brows furrowed. After you left yesterday, I made some calls, Lydia said, lowering her voice. I have a friend at the National Military Working Dog Registry. I asked her to dig deeper into Phantom's records. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out several folded pages freshly printed. These came through an hour ago. She handed the papers to Elliot. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded them. These weren't the discharge certificate he'd seen yesterday. These were training records, personnel files, service history. At the top of the first page, Handler of Record Gunnery, Sergeant Dominic J. Reeves, USMC. The world stopped. Elliot stared at the name. The letters seemed to pulse and blur. Dominic. Not just any Dominic. His Dominic. Corporal Dominic Reeves, the 23-year-old machine gunner who had been walking 6 feet to Elliot's left when the IED detonated on June 18, 2010. The Dominic that Axel had saved. Training location Camp Pendleton. K-9 Training Facility, California. Training start date January 11, 2016. Service period January 2016 to October 2023. Deployment history: Syria, Iraq, multiple classified MARSOC operations. Certification patrol, explosives, detection, high-value target, apprehension. Elliot's vision blurred. He blinked hard, forcing the words back into focus. Phantom wasn't just a traumatized military dog. Phantom was Dominic's dog. Dominic had become a handler after Helmand, after Axel, after Elliot had vanished into the mountains. Dominic had taken up the work that Elliot had abandoned. You know him, Lydia said quietly. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the recognition flash across his face, the way all the color drained from it. Elliot couldn't speak. He just stared at the paper, at the name he hadn't seen in 14 years. The handler who'd trained Phantom, who'd worked with him for 7 years across multiple war zones, who'd built the foundation that was still there beneath all the trauma, was the same man Elliot had abandoned on a dusty road in Afghanistan. The same man whose life Axel had saved. The same man Elliot had left to bury that hero alone. And now his dog was here in this kennel, broken and terrified, and 48 hours away from being euthanized by a system that didn't understand what he'd been through. The coffee mug shook in Elliot's hand. Lydia gently took it from him before he could spill it. There's more, she said, softly flipping to the next page. Dominic retired in December of 2023. Medical discharge. The notation says PTSD severe. He was supposed to adopt Phantom under the handler adoption program. She paused, but he couldn't. The paperwork shows Phantom was transferred to a civilian adoption agency instead. 3 months later, that man, the one who beat him, adopted Phantom from the agency. Her voice was thick with anger and sadness. Dominic tried Elliot. He tried to keep his dog, but his own demons were too loud. Elliot folded the papers carefully, his hands moving on autopilot while his mind reeled. He put them in his jacket pocket, right next to the discharge certificate from yesterday. "I need to go," he said, his voice hollow. Lydia nodded. She understood. Some truths needed to be processed alone. "I'll leave you alone," she said. She walked back toward the office, leaving Elliot standing in the morning sun, carrying the weight of a connection he'd never expected. Inside the kennel, Phantom watched the man who smelled like mountains and smoke and old leather, the man who knew the words, the man who was standing very still looking at something Phantom couldn't see. Elliot picked up his stool and walked to his truck. He sat in the cab for a long time, staring at nothing. He needed to think. He needed to decide. But more than that, he needed to know the truth, the real truth, not the story he'd been telling himself for 14 years. He started the engine and drove. Not back up to the clearing, not back to the cabin. He drove south on Highway 68 past the turnoff to the Taos Pueblo, past the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge, until he reached the junction with Interstate 25. There at the edge of the highway was a 24-hour truck stop, an island of fluorescent light against the darkening sky. It was nearly 9 p.m. now. Elliot had been driving for hours, circling, delaying the inevitable. He parked away from the main building near the air pumps. He sat in the truck for 20 minutes staring at the phone number he'd pulled from his wallet. Then he got out and walked inside. The truck stop smelled like diesel and fried food and burnt coffee. A handful of long-haul drivers sat in booths staring at phones or into the middle distance. No one looked up when Elliot walked past. In the back corner, near the restrooms, was an old payphone, the kind that was almost extinct, a relic from a different era. Elliot stood in front of it for a long time. The small piece of paper in his hand was nearly transparent from 14 years of folding and unfolding. On it was written a single name and a phone number, Dominic Reeves. He'd carried this paper since August of 2010. He'd never used it. His fingers were stiff and clumsy as he fed coins into the slot. The mechanical sound was unnaturally loud. He lifted the heavy receiver, his hands shaking, and punched in the numbers. The dial tone was a long, hollow sound, then ringing. Once, twice. On the third ring, a voice answered, thick with sleep, rough, confused. "Yeah." "Who is this?" Elliot's throat closed. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal of the phone housing. "Dominic," he managed. "It's Elliot. Elliot Hayes." The silence on the other end was absolute. It stretched for 5 seconds. 10. Elliot could hear the faint hum of the open line, the buzz of the truck stop's freezers behind him. When Dominic spoke again, his voice was completely different. Not sleepy, cold, sharp, wide awake. "Elliot." The name was an accusation. "After 14 years, you're alive." There was no relief in his voice, no joy, just shock and anger held barely in check. "Why are you calling me?" "I needed," Elliot started. His voice cracked. "I just needed to hear your voice." "You needed." Dominic's voice rose. "You needed what?" "You vanished, man. Just gone. No funeral, no wake, not a goddamn word. We thought you were dead. We didn't know what the hell happened to you. Why are you calling me now?" At 3 in the morning, Elliot deserved this, every word. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry, Dom. I couldn't handle it." "You couldn't handle it." Dominic's voice was shaking now. "What about the rest of us? What about the guys who had to carry Axel's box off the plane? What about me?" There was a break in his voice on the last word. "I'm calling about Axel," Elliot said. He forced the words out, his voice barely a rasp. Another pause. The anger in Dominic's voice cracked, replaced by a sudden weary grief. "Axel, what about him? I need to say it." Elliot whispered, squeezing his eyes shut. "I need you to know. It was my fault, Dom." I hesitated. I saw him alert and I second-guessed him. I sent him forward. I gave a bad command. I got him killed. He braced for the confirmation. For Dominic to finally agree to give voice to the guilt that had been Elliot's only companion for 14 years. Instead, there was a strange sound on the other end of the line. A choked, disbelieving noise that might have been a laugh or a sob. What Dominic said. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated. Elliot repeated, his voice breaking. "I should have pulled back. I was tired. The heat, the stress, I wasn't thinking clearly. I sent him forward when I shouldn't have. I killed him." The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of complete, horrified shock. "Is that what you've been telling yourself?" Dominic's voice was rising again, but it wasn't anger this time. It was something closer to anguish. "For 14 years, is that why you disappeared?" "It's the truth," Elliot whispered. "No, The word was a shout, a complete denial of Elliot's entire reality. No, that's not what happened. Are you out of your mind? You think it was your fault? Elliot was stunned. His mind reeled. I saw it, he said weakly. The explosion. I gave the order to check. You saw nothing. Dominic said, and now he was almost sobbing, a raw, painful sound that echoed through the phone line. You were exhausted, we all were. We'd been up for 22 hours straight, but Axel was perfect. He alerted on that IED. You called it in, you did everything right. But the explosion Elliot started. The IED wasn't where he alerted. Dominic cut him off, his voice cracking. It was a decoy, Elliot. A fake device on the road rigged to draw us in. The real bomb, the pressure plate, it was buried 3 feet to the left, designed to kill the EOD team when they came to check the decoy. Elliot leaned against the wall. The floor felt unsteady beneath him. What? It was a secondary device, Dominic said, his voice thick and wet with tears. A pressure-activated IED. It was aimed at our position at the team. Axel alerted on the first one like he was trained. But then then he smelled the second one. The real one. He knew it was there. No, Elliot whispered. Yes, Dominic said. He didn't move forward because of your command. He moved because I did. The world stopped spinning. Time itself seemed to freeze. I stepped off the patrol line. Dominic continued, his voice breaking completely now. I was moving toward the decoy to mark it for EOD. And Axel, he saw me. He saw me step directly onto the pressure plate. Dominic was crying now, the sound harsh and uncontrolled, echoing through the phone line across 1,000 miles. He lunged at me, Elliot. He hit me with his full body weight, knocked me 6 feet backward, completely off the trigger mechanism. He saved my life. A pause, a shuddering breath, and then he went back. He went back and put his own body on that plate. He held it down with his weight so it wouldn't detonate while we cleared the area. He held it for 45 seconds, Elliot. 45 seconds, buying us time to get to cover. Dominic's voice was barely intelligible now. The device was on a timer, a backup trigger. He knew. Somehow he knew it was going to blow, and he stayed on it anyway. He stayed so we could get clear. The receiver was shaking violently in Elliot's hand. He took the whole blast himself, Dominic said through his tears. He died saving my life, not yours, mine. He was a hero, Elliot, the best of us. And you just ran. The words hit like physical blows. You left me to bury him alone. Dominic continued, his voice ragged. You left me to carry that story by myself for 14 years. Do you have any idea what that was like? Knowing he died for me, knowing you blamed yourself for something that was never your fault. Elliot couldn't breathe. The truth was a physical weight crushing his chest, making his lungs seize. 14 years. 14 years of self-imposed exile. 14 years of silence. 14 years of running from a failure that had never happened. His guilt wasn't wrong, it was just pointed in the wrong direction. He wasn't guilty of killing Axel. He was guilty of abandoning Dominic, of leaving his teammate, the man Axel had died to save, alone, with the truth and the grief and the unbearable weight of being saved. Dom Elliot said, his voice hollow, unrecognizable. I didn't know, I'm so sorry. I didn't know, yeah, Dominic said quietly. The anger was gone now, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion. That's because you ran, Elliot. You ran and you left the rest of us to deal with it. To deal with him being a hero. To deal with the guilt of being alive when he wasn't. The line was quiet except for the sound of Dominic's breathing, slow and shaky, like a man who just stopped running himself. I'm glad you're not dead, man, Dominic said finally. His voice was flat, empty. I really am. But I can't do this right now. I gotta go. A soft click. The line went dead. Elliot stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the truck stop, the receiver still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. He hadn't been set free. He'd just been handed a different, heavier set of chains. He slowly hung up the phone. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a coward. A man who had run from the trail because facing Dominic, facing the reality of Axel's sacrifice, had been too hard. He walked out into the cold desert night, got in his truck, and sat there. The dashboard clock read 3:27 a.m. He had to go back. Not to save Phantom from a ghost, from a mistake that had never happened, but to save them both from the present, from the truth. The drive back to Taos was a blur. The dark highway unspooled in front of his headlights, but Elliot was seeing a sun-blasted road in Helmand. He was not unburdened. He was rearranged. The crushing guilt of failure, the guilt that had defined him for 14 years, was gone. In its place was something sharper, cleaner, more honest. the grief of cowardice. Axel hadn't died because of a bad command. He had sacrificed himself. He had made a conscious choice seeing Dominic step onto that pressure plate and had done what working dogs were trained to do, protect their team at any cost. He had been a hero, and Elliot had not stayed to honor that. He hadn't stood by his teammates. He had taken his grief, his misplaced guilt, wrapped it in a lie he'd told himself, and vanished into the mountains. He had let Axel's legacy be forgotten. He had let Dominic carry the weight of being saved alone for 14 years. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white in the darkness. He understood now. He wasn't just trying to save a traumatized dog from a 7-day deadline. He was trying to atone for abandoning a hero, for abandoning the man that hero had saved. Phantom was the last piece of Dominic's life that Elliot could still reach, the last chance at redemption he would ever have. He arrived at the shelter as the first thin light of dawn painted the eastern sky purple and gold. It was September 18th. The parking lot was empty. He had 4 days left. 4 days to prove Phantom could be saved. 4 days to do what he should have done 14 years ago. Stand and fight instead of run. He walked with a new heavy purpose to the quarantine wing. He heard Phantom stir before he saw him. The low warning growl, the sound of claws on concrete, the breathing of an animal bracing for the day's inevitable stress. Elliot stopped at the equipment closet. Captain Kane had given him a key 2 days ago, a gesture of trust that Elliot hadn't fully appreciated until now. He unhooked the key from the pegboard. He did not get his stool. He did not get his book. He walked directly to Phantom's kennel, his boots echoing in the concrete hallway. The dog scrambled to his feet instantly, hackles rising. When Elliot did not stop, did not sit, did not follow the pattern they'd established, Phantom's growl intensified. It was a sound of warning and confusion. "Stay back. You're breaking the rules. This isn't how this works." Elliot ignored it. He put the key in the heavy padlock. The sound of the lock clicking open was unnaturally loud in the concrete hallway. Phantom exploded. He launched himself at the gate, a furious, desperate wall of gray and white fur. He hit the chain link with his front paws, the rattle of metal deafening in the enclosed space. He was barking, snarling, sniff-roping at the air, his teeth clacking against the wire mesh. "I will kill you if you come in here. I will fight until I can't fight anymore." Elliot took a deep breath. He did not smell the disinfectant of the shelter. He smelled the dust of Afghanistan, the cordite, the blood. He was no longer afraid of his past. He was just tired of running from it. He slid the bolt. He opened the gate just enough to slip inside. He latched it shut behind him. The click of the latch was like a gunshot in the confined space. Phantom screamed. It was not a bark. It was a high-pitched, terrified, desperate sound, the sound of an animal who believed with absolute certainty that he was about to die. He scrambled backward, his claws scrabbling on the concrete, crashing into the far wall with a thud that had to hurt. He was cornered, trapped. This was the end. He snarled, his lips pulled back to expose every tooth, his entire body trembling so hard, Elliot could see the vibrations from 10 feet away. Elliot did not move. He just stood there, his back to the gate, giving the dog the entire run. All 12 feet of space. He did not make himself small. He did not crouch. He did not look away. He just stood there, a man who had finally stopped running. The dog's frantic snarls filled the air, bouncing off the concrete walls, a symphony of terror and rage. But through the panic, through the noise, Phantom was seeing this man for the first time. This was not the man who sat on the stool. That man had been tense, coiled, haunted by something Phantom could smell in his sweat in the set of his shoulders. Guilt, fear, hesitation. That man had been unpredictable, potentially dangerous in his brokenness. This man was different. He was heavy with something, but the fear was gone. The restless, guilty energy that had made him unsafe was gone. This man was solid, an anchor in deep water, and Phantom, adrift in an ocean of terror, had no idea what to do with him. The snarling faltered. It became a low, confused growl. The dog's ears were still pinned flat against his skull, but his head was rising now, tilting, watching, trying to process. Elliot, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man approaching an unexploded bomb, lowered himself to his knees. It was a position of total vulnerability. No handler knelt in front of an aggressive dog. It was against every rule, every safety protocol. He rested his hands on his thighs, palms up. He looked at Phantom, and Phantom looked back. "He was a hero," Elliot whispered. His voice was rough, broken with emotion he'd kept buried for 14 years. Phantom's head tilted further. The growling stopped, completely replaced by an anxious, high-pitched whine. His name was Axel, Elliot said. The words were for himself, not the dog. He wasn't a failure. He wasn't a victim of my bad command. He was a hero. He saw danger. He saw my friend about to die. And he made a choice. Elliot's voice cracked. He saved Dominic. He gave his life so the man I served with could go home, could have a future, could train you. He was not confessing to Phantom. He was confessing in front of him. He was laying his broken, rearranged soul bare on the cold concrete. He was a handler with no tricks left, no training protocols, no professional distance. He was just a man finally telling the truth. And I ran. Elliot continued, tears streaming down his face into his beard. I ran away from his sacrifice. I left Dominic alone. I let 14 years pass, and I never told him. I never thanked him for being alive, for being worth saving. Phantom's entire body seemed to deflate. The rigid terror that had held him upright for days was being met by something it didn't understand. Something it had never encountered before. Profound, exhausted honesty. Grief without threat. Confession without demand. The man was not a threat. The man was broken just like him. The dog took one hesitant step forward. His belly was low to the ground, his movement slow, cautious. Then another step. He moved like he was approaching a rattlesnake ready to bolt at any second. He stopped just out of Elliot's reach, 3 feet away. His black nose twitched, sniffing the air, reading the invisible story written on this man. He smelled the salt of fresh tears, the adrenaline of a 14-year-old truth finally spoken, the leather and smoke and mountain cold that clung to Elliot's jacket. But underneath it all, something new. Peace, or the beginning of it. Elliot didn't move. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't speak. He just waited, kneeling on the concrete, his face wet, his hands open. Phantom took the last step. He stretched his long neck forward, and then, in a gesture of profound, unspoken trust that neither of them fully understood, he pressed his head hard against Elliot's chest. He didn't nudge. He didn't lick. He didn't wag his tail. He just pushed, leaning his full weight into the man as if trying to hold Elliot up. Or perhaps to hold himself up. He was anchoring himself to the only solid thing in his world. The only human who had ever knelt in front of him without demands, without violence, without lies. Elliot's breath hitched. He closed his eyes. Slowly, with infinite care, he raised his hands. He did not pet the dog. He cupped Phantom's broad head between his palms, his fingers sinking into the thick fur, and he held him. Just held him. For the first time since June 18th, 2010, Elliot Hayes wept. He wept for Axel's sacrifice. He wept for Dominic's 14 years of carrying that weight alone. He wept for the time he had lost the connections he had severed, the life he had wasted hiding from a truth he'd been too afraid to face. He held the traumatized dog, and the dog held him back. And in the cold, quiet hallway of the Taos County Animal Shelter, 2 veterans, 2 broken soldiers began to heal. They stayed that way for a long time. Minutes stretched into an hour. Neither moved. It was a silent monument to shared scars, to the understanding that sometimes salvation comes not from being saved, but from saving someone else. When Elliot finally pulled back, his face wet and his eyes red, Phantom didn't retreat. The dog sat, his movements stiff and uncertain, but he sat. His amber eyes watched Elliot's face with an intensity that was no longer fear. It was focus, connection, the beginning of trust. "Sits," Elliot said softly. Phantom was already sitting, but his posture straightened slightly at the command. Muscle memory fighting through trauma. "Good or young," Elliot whispered. "Good boy. Brave boy." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small piece of dried venison, the good kind he'd prepared himself from a deer he'd hunted last fall. He held it out, palm flat, fingers together. Phantom hesitated. His entire body trembled. Every instinct told him that hands were dangerous, that offerings came with prices, that nothing was free. But he leaned forward, stretched his neck, and gently, carefully took the meat from Elliot's hand. His tail, which had been clamped tight against his body for 6 days straight, gave one small, tentative wag. Just one. But it was real. Elliot's throat tightened with emotion he didn't have words for. He stood slowly, his knees protesting, after an hour on concrete. Phantom stood with him, watching, no longer coiled to attack. Elliot turned and walked to the gate. He opened it, stepped through, and closed it behind him. He did not look back. But he heard Phantom move to the front of the kennel, heard the soft sound of the barn lying down near the gate just a few feet from where Elliot had been kneeling, waiting. Outside, the sun was fully up. The September morning was clear and bright, the sky a deep, endless blue. Captain Kane was standing by the office, a mug of coffee in his hand. He'd watched the entire thing through the security camera monitor in his office, unable to look away from the raw honesty of what he was witnessing. When Elliot walked out, Kane just nodded. "That was brave," he said quietly. Elliot shook his head. "It was necessary." Kane studied him. "Something's changed in you." Elliot looked back toward the quarantine wing, toward the kennel where a traumatized dog was learning to trust again. "Everything's changed," he said. He walked to his truck, but he didn't leave. He sat in the cab, thinking. 4 days left, September 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st. Then the deadline at 5 p.m. on the 22nd. He needed to move faster now. He needed Phantom to accept the muzzle, to walk on a leash, to prove to the county that he was manageable for transfer to the sanctuary in Colorado. But more than that, he needed to understand what he was really doing here. He wasn't saving Phantom to replace Axel. That was impossible. No dog could replace another. He was saving Dominic's dog, the last living piece of the man he'd abandoned, the last connection to the teammate who'd been worth Axel's sacrifice. It was the only apology he knew how to make. He started the engine and drove back up to his clearing. Not to hide, not to run, to prepare. He had work to do. The next 3 days moved with the accelerated rhythm of a countdown, each hour marked by small victories and careful progress. September 19th. Elliot arrived at dawn with a black tactical muzzle, the basket-style type used in military working dog training. The kind that allowed a dog to pant, to drink water, to exist without the claustrophobic panic of having their jaw strapped shut. He didn't try to put it on Phantom. He simply sat inside the kennel, the gate closed behind him, the muzzle resting on the concrete between them, and waited. Phantom circled it like it was a coiled rattlesnake. He whined, high-pitched and anxious. The muzzle was connected to his pesam, to the man who had beaten him to pain and helplessness and rage. But it was also connected to something deeper. To work. To purpose. To a handler named Dominic who had trained him with patience before the world went wrong. By noon, Phantom would approach within 2 feet of it, his nose twitching, reading the scents of metal and nylon and old leather. By sunset, he would sniff it directly without retreating. Elliot left it in the kennel overnight. September 20th. The muzzle was still there, exactly where Elliot had left it. Phantom had moved it slightly, nudging it with his nose, investigating it in the dark hours. Elliot brought a 6-foot leather lead, the kind he'd used with Axel. Well-worn, soft, with a solid brass clip. He clipped it to Phantom's collar while the dog was eating his morning meal, the distraction of food giving him the necessary seconds. Phantom felt the weight of it and froze, his entire body going rigid. Then he bolted to the far corner, the lead trailing behind him like a snake. Elliot didn't pull. He just held the other end loosely, standing still, letting Phantom feel the connection without the control. It took 4 hours before Phantom stopped trying to shake it off. By evening, he would walk 3 steps with it attached before sitting down hard, overwhelmed. Progress. September 21st, 4 p.m., 16 hours before the deadline. Elliot combined them, muzzle and lead together. He spent an hour just sitting with Phantom, the muzzle in his lap, letting the dog investigate it, lick it, become familiar with it as an object rather than a threat. Then, moving slowly, speaking in low German commands, Elliot fitted it over Phantom's muzzle. The dog's entire body trembled, but he allowed it. Elliot clipped the lead. Phantom took 3 steps forward. Just 3. Then he sat down hard, panting, through the muzzle's openings, looking up at Elliot with an expression that was equal parts terror and trust. "What now?" "What do you want from me?" Elliot knelt in front of him. "Guter Junge," he said. "Brave boy. So brave." He removed the muzzle after 60 seconds. That was enough for today. Outside the kennel, Lydia had been documenting everything with her phone camera, short clips that would serve as evidence of progress for the county board. Captain Kane watched from the office, his weathered face cautiously hopeful. "We have it," Lydia said that evening, her voice bright but tense. "We can film the full walk test tomorrow morning." September 22nd. 50 feet muzzle and lead, no lunging, no aggression. That's the standard the county requires. She looked at Elliot. "If we get that video uploaded to the county portal by noon before the 5 p.m. deadline, we're safe." Mountain Ridge Canine Sanctuary confirmed they have space. Phantom can be transferred. Kane nodded slowly. "First thing tomorrow, 6 a.m. We film it, we upload it, and we get that dog out of here before Clayton Pierce shows up for his shift." Elliot stood in the parking lot watching the sun dip behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. For the first time in 14 years, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not peace exactly. That would take longer, maybe a lifetime. But the absence of the crushing weight, a lightness he'd forgotten was possible. He made a decision. He would drive home tonight, back to his cabin, sleep in his own bed for the first time in a week. He would return before dawn on the 22nd film, The Walk Test with Phantom, and then spend the rest of the day preparing the dog for transport to Colorado. Phantom would be safe there. They specialized in traumatized military working dogs. They had the resources, the expertise, the patience. Phantom would heal. And maybe Elliot thought maybe someday he could tell Dominic what he'd done. Maybe someday that would be enough of an apology. He drove up the mountain as the sky turned from gold to purple to black. The narrow Forest Service road was familiar enough that he could navigate it in the dark, though he kept his headlights on the high beams cutting through the pine trees. He reached the cabin at 8:30. The air at 9,000 feet was already cold enough to see his breath crisp and clean. He built a fire in the wood stove, heated a can of soup on the propane burner, and sat at his small table eating in silence. The silence felt different now. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It wasn't a punishment or a prison. It was just quiet. He finished eating, washed the pot and spoon in the dry sink, and lay down on his narrow cot. He pulled the wool blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. He slept deeply for the first time in years. And then at 9:43 p.m., the sky broke open. Elliot woke to the sound of thunder. Not the distant rumble of a storm rolling in from the west. This was close, immediate, a sharp crack that shook the cabin's windows in their frames and rattled the tin coffee pot on the stove. It sounded exactly like incoming artillery. Elliot's eyes snapped open, but he was not in his cabin. He was on the floor, his back pressed against the wall, his head covered with his arms, his body braced for the shockwave that would follow the impact. His breathing came in short, rapid gasps. His heart hammered against his ribs so hard it hurt. Incoming, incoming. Take cover. Get down. Another crack of thunder, this one so loud, it felt like the sky itself was splitting open directly above the cabin. The single overhead light flickered once, twice, and went out. Darkness. Elliot stayed on the floor, shaking his mind, caught between New Mexico and Helmand Province between 2024 and 2010. The thunder rolled and crashed in waves, and with each percussion, he was back in the dust and heat, smelling cordite and blood, hearing the screams of wounded men, feeling the ground shake beneath him. It took 15 minutes before his breathing slowed, before he could convince his body that he was not under attack, that this was just weather. Just a late-season monsoon rolling through the Sangre de Cristo range. He pulled himself to his feet, his legs unsteady, and looked out the window. The sky was a sickly yellow-green, the color that came before violence. The wind had picked up, bending the tall ponderosa pines nearly horizontal, their branches whipping and creaking. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in sheets, driven sideways by wind gusts that had to be 60 miles an hour. Lightning flashed, illuminating the clearing around his cabin in stark white light. Thunder followed immediately. The storm was directly overhead. Elliot stood at the window, gripping the frame, watching the storm tear through his mountain, feeling the old familiar dread settling into his bones like cold water. He was not the only one hearing the thunder. 23 miles away and 8,000 feet lower in elevation, the Taos County Animal Shelter sat in sudden darkness. The power had gone out at 9:47, 4 minutes after the first lightning strike hit a transformer on Highway 68. The backup generator kicked in immediately, but it only powered the essential systems. Climate control, the main kennels, the office computers. The lights in the quarantine wing stayed dark. Phantom had been asleep, curled in the corner of his kennel, his body finally relaxed after the breakthrough with Elliot that morning. The muzzle training, the lead work, the small piece of dried venison given freely without pain. The first crack of thunder brought him instantly awake. He was not in a kennel. He was in a firebase in Helmand Province, 2017, under mortar attack. The sound was unmistakable, burned into his neural pathways by 3 years of combat deployments. The sharp whistle and crack of incoming fire, the concussion that rattled through the bones. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide and white-rimmed, his pupils blown. Another crack. Closer. The building shook. Phantom began to scream. It was a high, thin sound, not a bark, but the sound of an animal in complete dissociative panic. He threw himself at the kennel gate. Once, twice. The metal rattled violently but held. Third impact. The latch, which had been stressed and slightly bent from 6 days of Phantom's earlier assaults, which Elliot had noticed but Captain Kane hadn't gotten around to replacing yet, gave way with a sharp metallic shriek. The gate swung open. Phantom didn't pause, didn't look around, didn't process. He was pure instinct, a biological machine programmed with a single directive. Run. Escape the kill zone. Find cover. Suave, he bolted down the dark hallway, his claws scrabbling on the concrete floor, slipping and catching. He hit the door to the main shelter at full speed. It was locked, heavy steel, unyielding. He spun wild-eyed, searching for an exit. Any exit. The clinic. There was a large cat door built into the lower panel of the clinic's exterior door, designed for moving supply boxes and equipment in and out without opening the main door. It was meant for cardboard boxes, not for 90-pound German shepherds. Phantom didn't care. He hit it with his shoulder, clawing and pushing, his body compressing, twisting. The plastic frame cracked under the impact. He forced himself through, feeling the broken edges tear at his fur, scrape his skin. He left tufts of gray and white fur caught in the jagged plastic and thin streaks of blood. He tumbled out into the storm. The rain hit him like a physical assault. The wind screamed. Lightning flashed, turning the night to day for a split second. Thunder cracked again, so close it felt like the air itself was exploding. And Phantom ran. He ran east, toward the foothills, toward the dark mass of the mountains, toward anywhere that wasn't here. Wasn't this place of cages and thunder and death falling from the sky? Behind him, the shelter sat quiet and dark, the broken cat doors swinging in the wind, the quarantine wing empty. No one would know he was gone until morning. The dawn of September 22nd came late and reluctant, the sun struggling to penetrate the thick cloud cover left by the storm. The rain had stopped around 4 in the morning, but the world it left behind was transformed. Branches down everywhere. Streets flooded in the low-lying areas. Power lines hanging loose and dangerous, sparking against wet pavement. Officer Clayton Pierce arrived at the shelter for his shift at 6:12 earlier than usual. His arm was still bandaged from Phantom's bite 8 days ago, but he'd been cleared to return to light duty. The wound was healing, but the psychological scar was still raw. He pulled into the parking lot and immediately saw the damage. The cat door on the clinic building was shattered, hanging at a broken angle, plastic shards scattered on the ground. His stomach dropped. He got out of his truck, his face tight with a mixture of suspicion and old fear, and walked around the building, checking windows and doors. Everything else was secure, locked, undamaged. But the cat door. He knelt down, examining it with the careful attention of a man trained in investigation. There was fur caught in the broken plastic, gray and white fur, and on the ground, barely visible in the wet gravel, paw prints. Large. Dog. Heading east. His hands started to shake. He pulled his radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Officer Pierce at the Taos County Animal Control Facility. I have a confirmed animal escape. Aggressive level 4 classification dog, possible PTSD combat triggers. Requesting Captain Kane and backup immediately." He stood up, looking toward the foothills that rose dark and steep to the east, and he walked to his truck and opened the rear equipment locker. Inside was a Remington 700 rifle, standard issue for wildlife control situations, for dangerous animals that couldn't be safely captured. His hands were still shaking as he checked the chamber. Captain Kane arrived 14 minutes later, his face grim. He'd gotten dressed in under 2 minutes, driving to the shelter with his heart in his throat. Dr. Lydia Warren pulled in right behind him, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She'd been awake most of the night, listening to the storm, worrying about the animals. They went directly to the quarantine wing. Phantom's kennel was empty. The gate hung open, the metal latch bent and broken. "Oh, no," Lydia whispered, her hand going to her mouth. "Oh, God, no, no, no." She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking, and dialed Elliot's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice rough with sleep and something else. Concern. "Lydia." "He's gone," she said, her voice breaking. "Oh, Elliot, I'm so sorry. The storm last night, the thunder." He broke out. "He's gone." Elliot was already moving. She could hear it through the phone. The rustle of clothing being grabbed, boots hitting the floor. "Where's Pierce?" Elliot asked. She looked out the office window. Pierce was standing by his truck, talking on his radio, the rifle slung across his back. "He's here," she said, "and he's armed." Elliot's voice went cold and hard. "Tell Kane I'm coming. Tell him to keep Pierce there. I'm 20 minutes out." The line went dead. Lydia ran outside. Captain Kane was standing with Pierce and 2 other officers, younger men, who looked nervous and out of their depth. Jensen barely 25, and Kowalski stockier and calmer but still tense. "Kane," Lydia said, grabbing his arm. "Elliot's on his way. He said to keep Pierce here." Kane looked at Pierce, who was checking his rifle with mechanical precision. Clayton Kane said, his voice carrying the authority of 23 years commanding men in high-stress situations. "You are not going up that mountain with that weapon." Pierce looked at him, and for the first time, Kane saw the fear behind the professional facade. The old trauma from the mauling 5 years ago. The 70 stitches, the nerve damage, the 8 months of physical therapy. "Captain, I have authorization," Pierce said. His voice was tight, controlled, but shaking at the edges. "That dog is a confirmed aggressive level 4 classification. He attacked me. He's loose in a populated area. I have every legal right to pursue and neutralize the threat." He chambered around. The metallic click was sharp and final in the quiet morning. "And today is the deadline," Pierce continued. "September 22nd, 5 p.m. If that animal is not secured and proven manageable by 5 p.m., the euthanasia order stands. I'm not waiting until 5 p.m. to have him attack a hiker or a kid walking to school." Kane's face went hard. "That's not your call to make. It became my call the second he escaped." Pierce shot back. "I'm going. You can file a complaint later." He started toward the trailhead to the old Sonora Mine access road. Clayton Kane called after him. "Please." Pierce stopped but didn't turn around. "I was mauled by a dog that everyone said was just scared," he said quietly. "Just traumatized. Just needed patience. I almost lost my arm. I almost lost my career. I'm not letting that happen to someone else." He walked toward the mountain. Kane turned to Jensen and Kowalski. "Set up a perimeter at the base of the trail. No one goes up except Pierce and Hayes. And if you see that dog, you radio me immediately. Do not engage." The two officers nodded and moved to their positions. Lydia stood beside Kane, tears streaming down her face. "This is my fault. I should have checked that latch. I should have reinforced it." Kane put a hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault. It's just what happened." But they both knew that didn't matter. In 18 minutes when Elliot arrived, none of that would matter. All that would matter was finding Phantom before Pierce did. Elliot's truck slid to a stop in the gravel parking lot at 6:43 a.m., the tires throwing up mud and small stones. He was out before the engine stopped ticking, moving fast. Kane met him halfway. "Pierce left 10 minutes ago," Kane said, "heading up the Sonora Mine Trail. He's got a rifle and a radio, and he's not listening to me." Elliot looked at the mountain at the dark tree line. "Where would Phantom go?" Kane asked. "If you were that terrified, injured." "Where would you hide?" Elliot closed his eyes, thinking. Putting himself in the mind of a combat dog in full PTSD panic. "High ground," he said. "Defensible position. Somewhere he can see threats coming from a distance. Somewhere that feels like a firebase. The old ore processing area." Elliot continued. "There's a flat rock shelf about 1.25 miles up the trail. It overlooks the valley. Clear sight lines in all directions. If he's looking for a defensive position, that's where he'd go. And that's where Pierce is headed," Kane said. Elliot nodded. He looked at Lydia. "How long until the deadline?" "Just over 10 hours, she said, checking her phone. 5 p.m. Elliot started walking toward the trail. "Elliot," Kane called. "He's got a rifle. If he sees Phantom as a threat—" "I know," Elliot said without turning around. He started to run. The trail was steep and treacherous, still slick from the overnight rain. Elliot climbed with the steady driving pace of a man who knew mountains and knew time was running out. He was 54, but adrenaline and purpose drove him forward like he was 20 years younger. He tracked as he climbed. The signs were easy to read. Too easy. Paw prints in the mud, deep and widely spaced. Phantom had been running full out, not walking. There were smears of blood on rocks and low branches. Fresh blood. From the scrapes getting through the cat door, maybe. Or from running through the forest in blind panic, hitting trees and rocks in the darkness. Elliot found tufts of fur snagged on thorns and broken branches. Gray and white, unmistakable. The dog was heading up, seeking altitude, seeking safety the only way he knew how. At the half-mile mark, Elliot heard voices ahead. He slowed, moving more quietly, using the terrain and the trees for cover. Through a gap in the pines, he saw Pierce. The officer was standing on a small outcrop of rock, scanning the terrain ahead with binoculars. The rifle was unslung now, held at low-ready position. Professional. Prepared. Pierce looked tense, wound tight, his entire body language screaming of a man at war with his own fear. Elliot watched him for 30 seconds, calculating. He could call out, could try to talk him down, appeal to his better nature, to his training. But he didn't have time for that. He moved off trail, circling wide around Pierce's position, using the skills he'd learned in a different desert, in a different life. Moving quietly. Using cover. Staying invisible. 20 minutes later, he was past Pierce and climbing alone toward the processing area. The old Sonora Mine ore processing area came into view at 8:57 in the morning. It was exactly as Elliot remembered from the few times he'd been up here over the years. A flat shelf of rock about 60 feet across littered with rusted equipment from the 1970s. Broken conveyor belts, collapsed timbers, a few pieces of old machinery so rusted they were barely recognizable. At the far edge of the shelf was what remained of a mine entrance, a vertical fissure in the rock face maybe 8 feet wide at the top, narrowing as it went down. A dangerous scar in the mountain. Elliot stopped at the edge of the clearing, his breathing controlled despite the climb. He listened. From below, from inside the fissure, he heard it. A low, rattling growl, the sound of an engine idling. The sound of a day who had been cornered and was prepared to die fighting. Elliot walked slowly to the edge of the fissure and looked down. 20 feet below, wedged in the narrow space, was Phantom. The dog had fallen or jumped in, probably running in the dark, panicked by the thunder, and had tumbled into the hole. His back right leg was trapped, held fast by a tangle of old rebar and collapsed timbers. He tried to stand, tried to pull free, but the leg wouldn't move. Blood matted the fur on his shoulder and flank from the cat door and the run through the forest. When he saw Elliot looking down, Phantom lunged upward as hard as he could. He snapped at the air, his teeth clacking, his entire body trembling with desperate, terrified rage. "Stay back! Stay away! I will kill you!" Elliot's heart broke. The dog wasn't a monster. He was just a soldier who'd been abandoned in a hole in the ground, trapped and injured and waiting for the end. "Easy," Elliot called down. His voice was calm, steady, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Easy, Phantom. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to get you out." Phantom snarled, a sound of pure disbelief. Elliot assessed the situation quickly. The fissure was nearly vertical, slick rock walls, no easy way down. But about 20 yards to the left, the slope was less severe. It was still steep, maybe 70 degrees, a treacherous slide of loose shale and exposed roots, but it led to a narrow ledge about 5 feet above where Phantom was trapped. It was the only way down and the only way back up. Elliot unzipped his leather jacket. He needed mobility. He checked his pockets. Knife, first aid kit, paracord, the essentials. He sat on the edge of the slope, dug his heels into the loose rock, and began to slide. The sound was loud, an abrasive scraping of boots on shale. It sent Phantom into another frenzy of barking, but Elliot didn't stop. He slid faster than he intended, the gravel tearing at his hands as he tried to slow himself at the seat of his jeans. He hit the ledge hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, gasping, his palms burning. Below him, Phantom was going wild, snapping at the rock walls, at his own trapped leg, at the air itself. Elliot sat up, slowly assessing. His hands were torn up, bleeding. He pulled the small canvas first aid kit from his jacket pocket and opened it. He cleaned his hands with an antiseptic wipe, hissing at the sting, then wrapped them methodically with gauze. Phantom watched him, the growl continuous but lower now. "He was a hero," Elliot said quietly, his voice echoing slightly in the narrow space. Phantom's ears twitched. "Axel, my partner." Elliot secured the bandage on his left hand, talking as he worked. "I told myself for 14 years that I got him killed, that I gave a bad command." He wrapped the other hand. But it wasn't true. He saved Dominic. He saw the trap. He saw my friend about to step on that pressure plate, and he didn't hesitate. He made a choice. He gave his life so Dominic could live. Elliot looked down at Phantom. "And Dominic, he became a handler because of Axel, because he wanted to honor that sacrifice. And he trained you. He gave you purpose. He gave you 7 years of good work." Phantom was whining now, a high-pitched, anxious sound. He was listening, processing. "We've both been trapped," Elliot said. "Me by a lie, I told myself. You by fear. By the men who hurt you after you served. By thunder that sounds like mortars. By this hole." He stood up on the narrow ledge. "But today we get out. Both of us." He carefully lowered himself off the ledge, his hands protesting the movement, and dropped the last 5 feet to the floor of the fissure. He landed in a crouch, his knees absorbing the impact. Phantom snarled, a reflex, but he was too weak, too exhausted, too trapped to do more than bare his teeth. "Easy," Elliot murmured. "I see the problem. We'll fix it." He moved slowly toward the trapped leg, not the dog's head. The rebar was twisted around the leg just above the hock joint, but the rock holding it in place was fractured loose from the storm or from Phantom's struggles. Elliot grabbed the largest piece of rock with both hands, ignoring the pain in his torn palms, and pulled. It came free with a grinding sound. Phantom yelped a sharp cry of pain as the pressure released suddenly. The leg was free, but it wouldn't hold weight. The ankle was swollen, possibly fractured. "I know," Elliot said softly. "I know it hurts, but we have to move." He pulled his belt from his jeans, the thick leather one he'd worn for 20 years, and fashioned it into a makeshift slip lead. He looped it carefully over Phantom's head. The dog flinched but allowed it. Now comes the hard part, Elliot said. He looked up at the way out. The path he'd slid down was impossible to climb back up carrying an injured dog. But at the far end of the fissure, maybe 25 yards away, the rockfall had created a steep, narrow goat trail, almost vertical, loose stone and exposed roots in pure desperation. But it was a way out. We have to climb, Elliot said. He tugged the belt gently. Come on, soldier. We go together, you and me. He began to climb, scrambling up the first few feet of loose rock. He looked back. Phantom was standing on 3 legs, whining his eyes wide, terrified of being left behind in this hole. Forwards, Elliot commanded. Forward, up, come up. Phantom looked at the path, looked at the man, and made a choice. With a painful whimper, he put his front paws on the first rock. He scrambled his injured leg, dragging behind him uselessly. He slipped, scrabbled, caught himself. Again, Elliot said, climbing just ahead of him, using the belt as a guide, not a leash. Up. Keep coming. You can do this. It was agonizing. Phantom was 90 pounds of dead weight and pure adrenaline. Elliot was scrambling, pulling his torn hands, leaving blood on the rocks. They slipped. Rocks tumbled down behind them, clattering into the depths. Phantom cried out as his injured leg hit sharp edges, but he kept climbing. He was following the command. He was trusting the voice. They moved as one unit, a single organism of desperation and faith and refusal to give up. Elliot grabbed the final edge, the lip of the fissure, and hauled himself over. He turned immediately, braced his feet against a boulder, and pulled on the belt with everything he had. One more, he said, his voice straining. Up, Phantom. One more, almost there. Phantom gave a final desperate lunge. His front paws scrabbled over the edge. Elliot grabbed his collar with both hands and pulled, ignoring the screaming pain in his torn palms. They collapsed together on the flat rock of the processing area, both panting, both exhausted. Phantom crawled the last 2 feet and put his head in Elliot's lap. He began to lick the blood from Elliot's bandaged hands, a gesture of gratitude, of connection, of something that didn't have words. Elliot sat there, his back against a boulder, his chest heaving, and led him. They had made it out. They sat there for 5 minutes, both catching their breath, neither willing to move yet. Then Elliot heard it. Footsteps, boots on rock, coming up the trail from below. He tensed, expecting Pierce with the rifle. But the voice that called out wasn't Pierce's. Elliot Hayes. The voice was familiar, impossible, but familiar in a way that made Elliot's heart stop. He stood slowly, Phantom struggling to stand with him, and turned toward the sound. A figure emerged from the tree line at the edge of the processing area. 51 years old, dark hair shot through with gray, wearing jeans and a faded Marine's hoodie and carrying a tactical backpack. His face was lined with the same hardships that marked Elliot's, the same scars of service and loss. Dominic Reeves. He stopped 20 feet away, staring. Neither man moved, neither spoke. The silence stretched, filled with 14 years of absence and guilt and unspoken pain. Lydia called me, Dominic finally said. His voice was shaking. 2 days ago, after you called me, she told me you were trying to save my dog. She told me about the deadline, about Pierce. She said you might need help. Elliot couldn't speak. His throat was closed. I drove straight through from Phoenix. Dominic continued. 22 hours, only stopped for gas. Got to the shelter an hour ago. Kane told me you'd gone up the mountain. He took a step closer. I wasn't ready to talk on the phone, Elliot. But I couldn't let you do this alone. Phantom whined his ears suddenly forward. He was reading something in the voice and the scent carried on the wind. Recognition. Dominic's eyes went to the dog, his face crumpled. Hey, Phantom, he whispered. Hey, boy, it's me. Phantom's tail began to wag, slow, uncertain, confused by pain and trauma and time, but real. The tale of a boy who remembered somewhere deep in his broken mind a handler who had loved him. Dominic looked back at Elliot, tears streaming down his face openly. I'm sorry, he said, for what I said on the phone, for being angry. You didn't deserve that? Yes, I did, Elliot said, finding his voice. I left you alone with all of it. That's unforgivable. Dominic wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand. When I retired, when they medically discharged me, I tried to take him, he said, looking at Phantom. I wanted to. The handler adoption program, it was supposed to be automatic. But I couldn't. My PTSD was too loud. I was having panic attacks, flashbacks. I couldn't take care of myself, let alone him. His voice broke. So they transferred him to civilian adoption. And somehow he ended up with that bastard who beat him, who broke him. He looked at Elliot. I failed him just like you think you failed Axel. You didn't fail him, Elliot said. You gave him 8 years of purpose. 8 years of being exactly what he was meant to be. What happened after, that's not on you. Dominic shook his head. We both ran, didn't we? From Axel, from each other. From the guilt, yeah, Elliot said. We did. I'm tired of running, Dominic said. Me too. They stood there, two broken men and a broken dog, on a mountain in New Mexico, finally facing each other after 14 years. Can we? Dominic started, then stopped. Can we try to fix this? All of it, Elliot looked at Phantom at the Guam, who was watching both men with confused hope in his eyes. Yeah, Elliot said, we can try. Dominic took another step forward, then another. And then he was close enough to see the blood on Elliot's hands, the tears on his face, the exhaustion in every line of his body. Let me help, Dominic said. Together they fashioned a makeshift stretcher from Dominic's backpack and Elliot's jacket. They lifted Phantom, carefully, the dog whimpering, but trusting, and began the long walk down the mountain. They were halfway down when they encountered Pierce coming up. The officer stopped on the trail, breathing hard from the climb, his rifle in his hands. He saw them, saw the dog on the makeshift stretcher, saw the blood, saw two men, two veterans carrying their wounded between them. Pierce's hands tightened on the rifle. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he lowered it. He's injured, Pierce said. It wasn't a question. His leg, Elliot said. Possible fracture, scrapes and lacerations. But he's manageable. He didn't attack. He was just scared. Pierce looked at Phantom for a long time. The dog looked back at him, not snarling, not lunging, just exhausted and hurting and trusting the men who carried him. I was wrong, Pierce said quietly. About him, about what scared looks like. He unslung the rifle and set it down on a rock beside the trail. My medical kit is in my truck, he said. That leg needs to be splinted and wrapped now or there will be nerve damage. He looked at Elliot. I can help, if you'll let me. Elliot studied him, saw the fear still there under the surface, but also the choice being made to do the right thing despite it. We'll let you, Elliot said. The walk down took another hour. When they emerged from the tree line at the trailhead, the small crowd waiting there let out a collective breath. Captain Kane, Dr. Lydia Warren, the two young officers Jensen and Kowalski, and a small gathering of shelter volunteers who'd heard and had come to help. They loaded Phantom carefully into a transport crate lined with blankets that Lydia had prepared. She administered a mild sedative for the pain and began cleaning the leg wound, while Pierce opened his professional medical kit and worked alongside her. Two people who'd been on opposite sides of this fight working together now. Captain Kane walked over to where Elliot and Dominic stood, both of them muddy and exhausted and unable to stop looking at each other. You did it, Kane said to Elliot. You saved him. Elliot shook his head. We saved him, all of us. He looked at Dominic, and we're just getting started. Kane checked his watch. It's 11:42. We have 5 hours and 18 minutes until the deadline. Lydia got video of the walk down the mountain. Phantom on a lead muzzled briefly for the camera comm, despite the injury. It's more than enough, he pulled out his phone. I'm uploading it to the county portal now, and I'm calling Mountain Ridge K9 Sanctuary. They can take him tomorrow if he's stable. No, Dominic said. Everyone turned to look at him. He's not going to a sanctuary, Dominic said. His voice was quiet but certain. He's coming home with me, where he should have gone 2 years ago. He looked at Elliot. If you'll help me, if you'll teach me what you know about handling trauma, about patience, Saz. Elliot felt something in his chest crack open, something that had been frozen for 14 years. Yeah, he said, I'll help. 6 months later, the first snow of the season dusted the Taos Valley. The small cottage behind the animal shelter no longer looked abandoned. The broken fence had been replaced with a secure 6-foot enclosure. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady stream. On the porch, Phantom lay in a patch of winter sun. His coat was thick and clean, gray and white fur shining. His back leg had healed, leaving him with a slight hitch in his gait, but it didn't slow him down much. He wasn't alone. Next to him lay another German shepherd, younger, black and tan, with bright, intelligent eyes. Axel II, adopted by Dominic from a Phoenix shelter 3 months ago. Inside the cottage, Elliot sat at a small desk reading an email on the laptop that Lydia had finally convinced him to buy. The email was from Jake Whitmore, a 27-year-old Army Ranger who'd completed the Warriors in Paws program 2 weeks ago. He and his dog, a hound mix named Whiskey, were doing well. Jake had gotten a job, had started sleeping through the night, had stopped having panic attacks. There were 6 other emails like it. 6 other veterans and their dogs all healing together. Elliot closed the laptop and walked outside. Dominic was in the yard working with a new arrival. A Belgian Malinois named Valor, fresh from a Marine unit in Syria struggling with the same trauma Phantom had shown. Dominic was using the techniques Elliot had taught him. Patience, distance, calm presence. It was slow work, but it was working. Across the yard, Officer Clayton Pierce was there too. Not in uniform, as a volunteer. He was working with a pit bull mix that had been labeled aggressive after biting its owner. Pierce had been the one to pick it up, to see the fear behind the aggression, to give it a second chance. He was learning slowly that fear didn't have to be the end of the story. Dr. Lydia Warren had been promoted to director of the Warriors and Paws program. She'd published a paper on PTSD rehabilitation in working dogs that was now required reading at veterinary schools across the country. The burnout she'd confessed to Elliot 6 months ago was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of work that saved lives. She still brought Elliot terrible coffee every morning, and he still drank it. Captain Kane had retired from the shelter, but he came by 3 times a week to help with intake assessments, to use his decades of experience to identify the dogs that could be saved and the handlers who needed them. Elliot watched it all from his porch, Phantom's head resting on his knee. This was what Axel's sacrifice had been for. Not for guilt, not for isolation, for this, for connection, for healing, for second chances, for saving the ones who could still be saved. A truck pulled into the parking lot, dark blue Ford F-150, travel-worn but well-maintained. Dominic got out, followed by Axel II. He walked over to Elliot's porch and sat down on the steps. "Got a call from a Marine unit at Camp Pendleton," Dominic said. "They've got a dog washing out of the program. PTSD, noise sensitivity. They're asking if we can take him." "Can we?" Elliot asked. Dominic smiled. "Yeah, we can." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow begin to fall more heavily, covering the valley in white. 2 men who'd spent 14 years running from the past, finally standing still. Finally home. The screen faded to black. White text appeared. "Every year, more than 1,600 retired military working dogs seek homes. Many suffer from PTSD, just like their handlers. The Warriors and Paws Foundation works to reunite these heroes with the people who understand them best. For Axel Phantom, Dominic Elliot, and all the soldiers, 2-legged, and 4 still fighting to find their way home. Thank you to the real handlers, the real dogs, and the real organizations doing this work every day." A final image, Elliot and Dominic sitting on the porch. Phantom and Axel II lying between them as the sun sets over the snow-covered mountains. Fade to black. End.